Let me ask you something. What happens when the most arrogant warriors in Europe, men who believe their birth and armor make them invincible, march into battle against an enemy who spent decades perfecting the art of destroying exactly their kind of fighter? You're about to find out. And I promise you, the answer involves 10,000 prisoners, mass executions, and French knights drowning in the Danube River because their armor was too heavy to swim. This is the Battle of Nicopolis, September 25, 1396. The day the last great crusade ended not in Jerusalem, not in glory, but in a bloodbath on the plains of Bulgaria. The day European chivalry learned that honor and courage mean nothing against disciplined tactics, and the day the Ottoman Empire proved they weren't just raiders from the east. They were the future. This wasn't supposed to happen. The crusade that marched to Nicopolis was the largest Christian army assembled in decades. 16,000 warriors from France, Hungary, Germany, England, Poland, Italy, led by King Sigismund of Hungary, one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, blessed by the Pope. Funded by the wealthiest nobles in Christendom, they marched east convinced they'd drive the Ottomans out of Europe, reclaim the Balkans, maybe even push to Constantinople. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and 10,000 of them would pay with their lives or their freedom. Before we dive into exactly how this disaster unfolded, here's what I need from you. If this video shows you the moment medieval warfare changed forever, if it teaches you what happens when tactics beat tradition, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me which part shocked you most. And subscribe, because we're telling the stories that textbooks skip. No romanticized knights in shining armor, no sanitized battles, just the blood, the stupidity, and the consequences. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back 628 years and watch chivalry die screaming. The year is 1396, and Europe is terrified. For decades, the Ottoman Turks have been expanding into the Balkans. They've conquered Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, large parts of Greece. Ottoman armies raid into Hungary, Wallachia, Poland. Constantinople, the last remnant of the Byzantine Empire, is surrounded and hanging by a thread, and nobody seems able to stop them. The Ottomans aren't barbarians. They're not the Mongol hordes sweeping out of the steppe. They're a sophisticated empire with professional armies, advanced siege technology, and tactical doctrine that's evolved through constant warfare. Their core military force is the Janissaries, slave soldiers taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained for war from childhood. They're disciplined, loyal, and lethal. Supporting them are Sipahis, feudal cavalry granted land in exchange for military service. And then there's the irregulars, Akinji raiders, and Azap infantry, used for harassment and overwhelming defenses through sheer numbers. Sultan Bayezid I commands this machine. He's in his late 30s, experienced, and earned the nickname Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, for the speed of his campaigns. He's already defeated the Serbs at Kosovo in 1389, crushed Bulgarian resistance, and beaten every Balkan army that faced him. Now he's besieging Constantinople and threatening Hungary. Europe's eastern frontier is collapsing. King Sigismund of Hungary has been fighting the Ottomans for years. He's lost battles, lost territory, and watched his kingdom's borders shrink. He knows he can't stop Bayezid alone, so he does what medieval kings do when facing existential threats. He calls for a crusade. In 1395, Sigismund sent envoys to the courts of Western Europe. To France, to England, to the Holy Roman Empire. His message was simple: the Ottomans are coming. If we don't stop them now, they'll overrun Hungary, then the German lands, then who knows where. He asked for help, and to his surprise, he got it. Pope Boniface IX officially proclaimed the crusade, offering indulgences to anyone who took the cross. This wasn't about reclaiming Jerusalem. This was about stopping the Ottoman advance into Christian Europe. It was defensive, pragmatic, and desperately needed. And for the first time in decades, Western European nobility responded enthusiastically. The French were especially eager. France had just signed a truce with England in their 100 Years' War. Thousands of knights and men-at-arms were idle, trained for war, but with no one to fight. A crusade against the infidel Turks offered glory, redemption, and adventure. It was exactly what French chivalry craved. John the Fearless, Count of Nevers and son of the Duke of Burgundy, volunteered to lead the French contingent. He was 25 years old, rich, ambitious, and had never seen real combat. With him came thousands of French knights, the cream of French nobility, young men raised on stories of Roland, Charlemagne, and the crusading ideal. Men who believed their armor, their horses, and their noble blood made them superior to any enemy. Other contingents joined. German knights, English volunteers, Polish cavalry, Italian adventurers, Knights Hospitaller from Rhodes. The army that assembled in Buda, Hungary, in the spring of 1396 numbered around 16,000 fighting men, plus thousands of support troops, servants, and camp followers. It was the largest Crusader army in a generation. And it was completely unprepared for what it would face. Sigismund tried to take command, but there was a problem. The French outnumbered everyone else and refused to accept Hungarian leadership. French knights considered themselves the finest warriors in the world. They looked down on Hungarians as backward Easterners who didn't understand proper chivalry. The English, the Germans, the Italians all deferred to French seniority, and the French made it clear they'd come to fight the Turks, not to take orders from Sigismund. This wasn't just arrogance. It was a fundamental cultural clash. French knights followed the code of chivalry, which emphasized individual honor, courage, and glory. Battle was an opportunity to prove your worth through personal combat. Tactics were for cowards. The idea of complex battlefield maneuvers, of coordinating with infantry, of actually planning beyond, charge the enemy and kill them, was foreign to their worldview. They were knights. They charged. They won. It was that simple. Sigismund knew better. He fought the Ottomans. He understood their tactics. He knew they used combined arms, that their cavalry was mobile and deadly, that their janissaries could shred charging knights with arrows and gunpowder weapons. He knew the Crusaders needed to fight as a unified force, following a coherent strategy, but he couldn't control the French. And without unity of command, the crusade was doomed before it started. In July 1396, the Crusader army marched east from Buda. They followed the Danube River through Hungary and into Ottoman-controlled territory. The march was less a military campaign and more a mobile party. The French contingent brought wagons full of wine, tents decorated like palaces, servants, cooks, musicians. They hunted, they feasted, they held tournaments. It was a grand adventure. Sigismund watched this circus with growing dread. The Crusaders captured several Ottoman-held fortresses along the Danube. Vidin surrendered without a fight. Oryahovo fell after a brief siege. These were small garrisons, unprepared for a major army. The easy victories convinced the French they were invincible. They boasted they'd march to Constantinople, then Jerusalem, then who knows where. The Turks were cowards who'd flee before French steel. By mid-September, the Crusader army reached Nicopolis, a fortified city on the southern bank of the Danube in modern-day Bulgaria. Nicopolis was important strategically, controlling a key crossing point and supply route. The Ottomans had a significant garrison there. Sigismund advised bypassing it, pushing deeper into Ottoman territory to force Bayezid into a battle on Crusader terms. The French refused. They wanted to besiege Nicopolis, take it by storm, and add it to their list of conquests. So the Crusaders settled in for a siege. They surrounded Nicopolis, brought up siege equipment, and waited for the walls to fall. It was slow, tedious work. The garrison refused to surrender. Days turned into weeks. The French grew bored. They went back to feasting and hunting, treating the siege like another entertainment. Discipline collapsed. Sentries weren't posted. Scouts weren't sent out. The Crusaders had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate camp. What they didn't know was that Bayezid was coming. The Sultan had been besieging Constantinople when word reached him of the Crusader army marching through Ottoman territory. He immediately lifted the siege, gathered his forces, and marched north at incredible speed. In less than 3 weeks, Bayezid moved an army of approximately 50,000 men over 300 kilometers of rough terrain. His nickname, The thunderbolt was well earned. Bayezid's army was everything the Crusader force was. Disciplined, organized, and tactically sophisticated. About 15,000 were Janissaries and other elite infantry. 20,000 were Sipahi cavalry. The rest were light cavalry and irregulars. Bayezid knew the Crusaders were at Nicopolis. He knew their approximate numbers, and he had a plan. On the night of September 24, Bayezid's army arrived near Nicopolis. They camped on high ground south of the city, hidden by the terrain. The Crusaders had no idea they were there. No scouts had been sent. No patrols had ranged beyond the immediate siege lines. The Crusaders were about to be surprised by 50,000 enemies, and they had no clue. On the morning of September 25, Ottoman scouts were spotted. Finally, the Crusaders realized an army was approaching. Sigismund immediately called a council of war. He laid out the tactical situation. The Ottomans were on high ground. They outnumbered the Crusaders 3-1. The smart move was to form a defensive position, force the Ottomans to attack uphill, and use Hungarian cavalry to hit them in the flanks once they were committed. It was sound strategy. The French rejected it. John of Navarre and his knights insisted they lead the attack. They charge up the hill, break the Ottoman line, and win the battle through sheer courage and shock. Sigismund argued this was suicide. The Ottomans would have archers, stakes, defensive positions. A frontal cavalry charge uphill against prepared defenses was madness. The French didn't care. They hadn't come all this way to sit in a defensive position like cowards. They were knights. They would charge. And they had seniority, so they would lead the vanguard. Sigismund gave in. He had no choice. If he refused, the French would charge anyway, and the whole Crusader army would fall apart. He agreed the French knights would lead the attack, followed by the other contingents, and finally the Hungarian cavalry under his command. It was a terrible plan, but it was the only way to maintain even a semblance of unity. The Crusader army deployed for battle. The French knights formed up in the vanguard, about 6,000 heavily armored cavalry. Behind them came the other European contingents, German and English knights, Italian mercenaries, about 4,000 men. Behind them, Sigismund positioned his Hungarian cavalry and Wallachian allies, another 6,000 horsemen. The French insisted on leading and refused to wait for the other contingents to form up properly. They were going to charge immediately and win the battle before anyone else got there. On the Ottoman side, Bayezid arranged his forces with tactical precision. In front, he positioned thousands of Akinji light cavalry and Azap infantry. These were expendable troops, there to slow the enemy and disrupt their formations. Behind them, on the slope of the hill, he placed sharpened stakes driven into the ground at angles designed to impale horses. Behind the stakes, ranks of Janissaries with bows, crossbows, and early firearms. And behind them, out of sight over the crest of the hill, his Sipahi heavy cavalry waited in formation. Bayezid wasn't trying to stop the French charge. He was trying to channel it, slow it, break it up, and then destroy it. The Akinji and Azaps would take the initial impact. The stakes would disrupt the charge. The Janissaries would massacre the disordered knights, and if any made it through, the Sipahis would finish them. It was a killing ground, carefully prepared. Around mid-morning, the French knights charged. 6,000 armored horsemen thundering uphill, lances lowered, banners flying. From their perspective, it must have looked glorious. The greatest cavalry in Europe, charging to victory against the infidel. They crashed into the Ottoman light infantry with devastating force. The Akinji scattered. The Azaps broke and fled. The French cut them down by the hundreds, riding over their bodies, pushing uphill. They were winning. It was exactly what they expected. And then they hit the stakes. The ground was covered with sharpened wooden stakes, invisible in the tall grass until horses were impaled on them. The front ranks of the French charge collapsed. Horses screamed, falling, throwing riders. Knights in full armor hit the ground hard. Some broke bones. Others were trapped under their dead horses. The charge lost momentum, bunching up as riders tried to avoid the stakes and their fallen comrades. The Janissaries opened fire. Thousands of arrows, crossbow bolts, and arquebus balls slammed into the stalled French knights. The arrows couldn't penetrate plate armor directly, but they didn't have to. They hit horses, found gaps in armor, struck unprotected faces. Men fell, horses collapsed. The French charge, which moments before had been unstoppable, was a confused mass of struggling men and dying animals stuck halfway up a hill under withering fire. Some French knights made it through. Maybe 1,000, the bravest or luckiest, pushed past the stakes, reached the Janissary lines, and engaged in close combat. The Janissaries fell back slowly, fighting in disciplined ranks. It wasn't a rout, it was a controlled withdrawal, and the French, exhilarated by what they thought was victory, chased them. They pushed over the crest of the hill, expecting to find a beaten enemy fleeing. Instead, they found 20,000 Sipahi cavalry, fresh and waiting in perfect formation. The Sipahis charged. The exhausted, disordered French knights, already reduced to maybe 1,000 effective fighters, were hit by a fresh wave of heavy cavalry 4 times their number. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. French knights were surrounded, pulled from their horses, beaten down. Some fought with incredible bravery, killing multiple enemies before being overwhelmed. It didn't matter, there were too many Ottomans. Within minutes, the entire French vanguard was destroyed. Down the hill, the rest of the Crusader army watched in horror. The other European contingents, the Germans and English, started to advance to support the French. Sigismund tried to coordinate a general advance, to commit his Hungarian cavalry. But before he could organize anything, Ottoman Sipahis came pouring over the hill, charging down into the disordered Crusader ranks. The battle turned into chaos. Crusader units fought in isolation, without coordination. The Germans held for a while before being surrounded and cut down. English knights tried to form a defensive position but were overrun. The Italian mercenaries broke and fled toward the Danube. Sigismund's Hungarian cavalry tried to charge but ran into Ottoman cavalry that outnumbered them and had the momentum. The Wallachian contingent, led by Mircea the Old, looked at the disaster unfolding and made a decision. They weren't dying for this. Mircea pulled his forces out and retreated north. He'd warned the Crusaders about Ottoman tactics. They hadn't listened. Now they could deal with the consequences. The Wallachian withdrawal opened a gap in the Crusader line that Ottoman cavalry poured through. Sigismund fought desperately to rally his troops. He was in the thick of the fighting, sword in hand, trying to hold the line, but it was hopeless. The Crusader army was disintegrating. Units were being surrounded and destroyed piecemeal. The Ottomans had complete tactical control. Sigismund's advisors begged him to flee. If the King of Hungary was captured or killed, it would be a political catastrophe. Reluctantly, Sigismund agreed. He and a small bodyguard fought their way to the Danube, commandeered a boat, and escaped downriver. He survived, but his army was destroyed. The rest of the Crusaders weren't so lucky. Thousands tried to flee to the Danube. Many were cut down by pursuing Ottoman cavalry. Others reached the river and tried to swim across. The Danube is wide and fast-flowing. Men in full armor don't swim well. Knights who'd spent fortunes on their plate armor drowned in the river, dragged under by the weight of the very equipment that was supposed to protect them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, of French nobles died this way. Drowning in a foreign river, weighed down by their armor, their last sight the muddy water of the Danube closing over their heads. About 10,000 Crusaders were captured. Some surrendered when surrounded. Others were too wounded to flee. A few were pulled from the Danube half-drowned. The Ottomans rounded them up, stripped them of armor and weapons, and marched them back to the Ottoman camp. Among the prisoners was John of Nevers, the French commander. He survived the battle and the rout, only to be captured ignominiously trying to hide in the chaos. That night Bayezid held council. He won a complete victory. The Crusader army was annihilated. Thousands were dead. Thousands more were prisoners. But the next morning, Bayezid learned that many of his light infantry, the Akinji and Azaps who'd absorbed the initial French charge, had been slaughtered. Estimates vary, but Ottoman casualties among those troops were probably 5,000 to 10,000. Bayezid was furious. His expendable troops were one thing, but the losses were higher than expected, and he blamed the prisoners. Bayezid ordered the execution of the Crusader prisoners. All of them except the highborn nobles who could be ransomed. About 3,000 men were led out in groups and executed, beheaded, throats cut, run through with spears. It took most of the day. Ancient sources describe Bayezid sitting on a throne, watching the executions, while his soldiers worked their way through the prisoners. When French nobles, who were being kept alive for ransom, begged him to stop, Bayezid ignored them. The executions were a war crime by medieval standards. Prisoners were supposed to be ransomed or enslaved, not massacred wholesale, but Bayezid was making a point. The Crusaders had marched into his territory, burned his cities, killed his people. This was retribution, and it was a message to Europe: invade Ottoman lands, and this is what happens. John of Navarre and the other high-ranking prisoners were spared. Their ransoms were set at astronomical sums. John's father, the Duke of Burgundy, eventually paid 200,000 gold ducats to free his son, an amount that would have funded a small war. It took 2 years to raise the money. John and the other nobles spent that time in comfortable captivity, treated with respect befitting their rank. The commoner prisoners who weren't executed were sold into slavery, scattered across the Ottoman Empire, and disappeared from history. The news of Nicopolis reached Europe slowly. Initial reports were confused. Some claimed victory, others disaster, but as survivors trickled back west, the truth became clear. The crusade had failed catastrophically. 16,000 warriors marched east. Maybe 6,000 came back. 10,000 were dead, captured, or enslaved. An entire generation of French nobility was gone. Every major noble family lost someone at Nicopolis. The political and social impact was enormous. The failure had immediate strategic consequences. The Ottoman advance into Europe was now unstoppable. With the largest Christian army in decades destroyed, there was no force capable of resisting Bayezid. He raided into Hungary with impunity over the next few years. He tightened the siege of Constantinople. He expanded Ottoman control in the Balkans, incorporating territory that would remain Ottoman for centuries. Nicopolis broke Christian resistance in southeastern Europe. For Sigismund, the defeat was politically devastating. He'd called the crusade, promised victory, and delivered disaster. Hungarian nobles blamed him. His authority was weakened. He spent years rebuilding his military and political position. He'd eventually become Holy Roman Emperor, but the stain of Nicopolis never fully washed away. For the French, Nicopolis became a national trauma. The flower of French chivalry, the best knights in Europe, had charged up a hill and been slaughtered like animals. The arrogance and indiscipline that led to the disaster was obvious to everyone. French military theorists spent decades analyzing what went wrong. Some lessons were learned, others weren't. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis was a triumph that resonated for generations. Bayezid had defeated the largest Christian army sent against him. He'd proven Ottoman military superiority. The victory cemented his reputation and strengthened Ottoman prestige across the Islamic world. For decades, no European power would dare challenge the Ottomans in open battle. Nicopolis bought the Ottomans breathing room to expand and consolidate, but there's an irony. Bayezid's triumph was cut short by an even greater catastrophe. In 1402, just 6 years after Nicopolis, Bayezid faced a new threat from the east. Timur, the Turco-Mongol conqueror, invaded Anatolia with an army of 200,000 men. At the Battle of Ankara, Timur crushed the Ottoman army and captured Bayezid himself. The Sultan who'd massacred Crusaders died a prisoner, locked in a cage, paraded through Timur's empire. The Ottomans were thrown into civil war as Bayezid's sons fought over the succession. The empire nearly collapsed. This bought Europe a reprieve. For 50 years after Ankara, the Ottomans were too busy with internal conflicts to launch major offensives into Europe. Constantinople survived until 1453. Hungary had time to rebuild. If Nicopolis had succeeded, if the Crusaders had defeated Bayezid in 1396, the Ottomans might have been weakened enough that Timur would have found an empire already cracking. We'll never know. History doesn't do hypotheticals. Let's analyze what actually happened at Nicopolis. How did 16,000 Crusaders lose so badly to 50,000 Ottomans? The numbers alone suggest a tough fight, but not necessarily a disaster. The answer is leadership, tactics, and cultural arrogance. Leadership first. The Crusaders had no unified command. Sigismund nominally led, but he couldn't control the French. John of Navarre was young, inexperienced, and more interested in glory than victory. The French knights refused to coordinate with other contingents, refused to follow strategy, and charged into battle without reconnaissance or planning. By contrast, Bayezid had absolute command. His army moved as one, executed complex maneuvers, and fought according to a coherent plan. Tactics. The Crusaders fought like it was 1100, not 1396. Heavy cavalry charges against prepared infantry positions. No combined arms, no coordination between cavalry and foot soldiers. They ignored terrain, ignored intelligence, and relied on shock and individual prowess. The Ottomans fought like a modern army. They used combined arms, light troops to disrupt, heavy troops to deliver the killing blow. They used terrain defensively, forcing the enemy to attack uphill over obstacles. They baited the enemy into a trap and executed it perfectly. Cultural arrogance. French knights believed they were inherently superior. Noble birth, expensive armor, and years of training made them unbeatable in their minds. The Ottomans were Eastern barbarians who'd flee before proper knights. This attitude blinded them to reality. The Ottomans were professional soldiers with decades of experience fighting everyone from Mamluks to Byzantines to Serbs. They'd evolved tactics specifically to counter heavy cavalry, and the French walked right into it. There's a broader lesson here about the collision of military cultures. Medieval European warfare in 1396 was still heavily influenced by chivalric ideals. Individual honor, glory in combat, disdain for non-noble soldiers. This produced excellent individual warriors but terrible armies. Eastern warfare, whether Ottoman, Mamluk, or Mongol, had moved past that. It emphasized discipline, combined arms, and tactical sophistication. When the two systems collided, the Eastern system won decisively. Nicopolis was one of the last battles where European chivalry fought according to purely medieval principles. The disaster taught European commanders that cavalry charges alone wouldn't win battles anymore. Infantry, artillery, coordination, all mattered. The evolution of European military doctrine in the 15th and 16th centuries was partly a response to defeats like Nicopolis. But the lessons came too late for the 10,000 men who died or were enslaved, for the 3,000 prisoners executed in one day, for the French knights who drowned in the Danube, their armor becoming their coffin. They paid the price for their leaders, arrogance, and incompetence. Let's talk about those executions specifically. Bayezid's decision to massacre 3,000 prisoners was shocking even by medieval standards. Prisoners had value as ransom or slaves. Killing them made no economic sense, but Bayezid was making a political and psychological point. He was demonstrating Ottoman power, he was punishing the invaders, and he was sending a message to Europe. This is what happens when you challenge us. The executions haunted the survivors. John of Navarre and the other French nobles who watched were traumatized. Some accounts say John wept openly as his men were killed in front of him. When he finally returned to France in 1398, he was a changed man. He never spoke publicly about the executions. The experience marked him for life. For the families of the executed men, there was no closure. Their relatives marched away to crusade and never came home. No bodies to bury, no confirmation of death for years, just rumors and eventually devastating certainty. The social impact rippled through France for decades. Entire villages lost their men, noble families lost heirs. The demographic and economic effects were severe. The prisoners who were enslaved rather than executed disappeared into the Ottoman system. Some were sent to galleys, rowing Ottoman warships. Others were sold to private owners, working farms or in households. A few converted to Islam and joined Ottoman service, starting new lives, but most lived and died as slaves, forgotten by history, their names lost. Sigismund's escape was controversial. Some praised him for preserving the kingdom's leadership. Others accused him of cowardice, fleeing while his men died. The truth is probably that his advisors forced the decision, recognizing that capturing the King of Hungary would be a disaster beyond the military defeat. Sigismund's survival allowed Hungary to continue as an organized state. If he'd died or been captured, Hungary might have fragmented, making Ottoman conquest even easier. The Danube crossing was where many of the most prominent casualties occurred. Nobles who survived the battle drowned trying to escape. Their bodies, weighed down by armor, were never recovered. Local legends claim that for years afterward, fishermen would pull up armor and weapons from the riverbed. Whether that's true or folklore, it captures the scale of the disaster. The Danube became a mass grave. In the immediate aftermath, Europe went through stages of grief. Denial first, refusing to believe the reports. Then anger, blaming Sigismund, the French, anyone. Then fear, realizing the Ottomans were unstoppable. The Pope called for a new crusade to avenge Nicopolis. Nobody came. The appetite for crusading against the Ottomans died at Nicopolis. Western European powers turned inward. France and England resumed their 100 Years' War. The German states dealt with internal Holy Roman Empire politics. Italy was consumed by city-state rivalries. Nobody wanted to face the Ottomans again. The eastern frontier was left to Hungary, Poland, and the Balkan states to defend alone, and they couldn't hold. Over the next 50 years, Ottoman power grew. They recovered from Bayezid's defeat at Ankara, reunified under Mehmed I, and resumed expansion under Murad II. By the time Mehmed II took Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans controlled most of the Balkans. The barrier that might have stopped them died at Nicopolis in 1396. There's a what-if question that haunts this battle. What if the Crusaders had followed Sigismund's advice? What if they'd formed a defensive position, forced the Ottomans to attack, and used their cavalry in coordinated counterattacks? Could they have won? Maybe. The numbers weren't impossible. With better tactics and discipline, the Crusaders might have made the battle competitive. But it would have required the French to swallow their pride, accept Hungarian leadership, and fight as a unified force. That was never going to happen. The French obsession with glory over victory wasn't unique to Nicopolis. It appeared again at Agincourt in 1415, where French knights charged into English longbowmen and were slaughtered. It appeared in Italy during the Wars of Italy, where French cavalry repeatedly charged into pike formations and lost. The culture of chivalry, with its emphasis on individual honor over collective effectiveness, crippled French military effectiveness for decades. Nicopolis was one of the clearest examples, but we should be fair to the French knights as individuals. They were brave. They fought with incredible courage. Many performed acts of heroism that would be legendary if they'd been on the winning side. The problem wasn't individual quality, it was collective stupidity. A brave man charging up a hill into prepared defenses without support isn't a hero, he's a corpse. The Battle of Nicopolis marked a turning point in European-Ottoman relations. Before Nicopolis, Europeans still thought they could defeat the Ottomans through traditional crusading methods. After Nicopolis, they knew better. The Ottomans weren't a temporary problem to be solved by a single campaign. They were a permanent empire that required sustained, coordinated resistance. That realization changed European strategy, even if execution remained flawed. For the Ottoman Empire, Nicopolis was proof of concept. Their military system, combining professional infantry, mobile cavalry, and tactical sophistication, could defeat anything Europe threw at them. This confidence drove expansion for the next century. Ottoman armies would push into Hungary, besiege Vienna, dominate the Mediterranean. They became a superpower because they'd proven at Nicopolis they could beat Europe's best. If you're still watching, I want your thoughts. Could the Crusaders have won with different tactics? Was the French charge as stupid as it looks, or were there factors that made it reasonable at the time? And what would have happened if the crusade had succeeded? Drop your answers in the comments. Let's debate this properly. And if this story taught you something, if you appreciate military history that doesn't sugarcoat the stupidity and the tragedy, hit that subscribe button. We are building a community that values real history, not the romanticized version, not the version where knights are always heroic and battles always make sense. The real version, where human beings make catastrophically bad decisions and pay for them in blood. Nicopolis matters because it's a clear example of how culture can override tactical sense. The French knights at Nicopolis knew intellectually that charging uphill against prepared defenses was risky. But their culture demanded they do it anyway. Honor required it. Chivalry required it. Their identity as knights required it. So they charged and they died. Culture killed them as surely as Ottoman blades. That pattern repeats through history. Armies that can't adapt to new realities lose to armies that can. The French at Nicopolis, the Ottomans at Lepanto, the Polish cavalry against German tanks. Technology and tactics evolve. Culture changes slowly. And when the gap between how you fight and how you should fight gets too wide, you lose. Badly. Now you know what happened at Nicopolis, not the legend of brave crusaders fighting the infidel. The reality of arrogant nobles charging into a trap, getting thousands of their men killed, watching survivors executed, and fleeing home in disgrace. You know how 16,000 Crusaders faced 50,000 Ottomans and lost so completely that Europe gave up on stopping Ottoman expansion for half a century. You know why the last great crusade ended not in Jerusalem, but in a bloodbath on the plains of Bulgaria. That's what we do here. We show you the battles that shaped history, told without the heroic nonsense and oversimplification. Because understanding what actually happened makes us smarter about power, about war, about the consequences of arrogance and incompetence. And there are more stories coming. More battles, more disasters, more moments where everything went wrong and the world changed because of it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.